Darryl Turpin. I'm co-principal of the Pinwheel Group. And I'm here today to talk about habilitation, empowerment, accountability therapy. But before I go into that, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I started working in drug courts probably in the early 90s. And what we saw right away was overrepresentation during the crack cocaine epidemic, overrepresentation of young African American males, young black males coming into our criminal justice system. And right away we knew that we were challenged with working with a population that would be high on the risk scale for criminogenic behavior, but we also saw some issues with substance use disorder on a wide level, some extremely high dependency issues, and then some kind of moderate population. So we had to roll up our sleeves and use interventions for a population that didn't really want to be there, mostly black men, as I mentioned earlier. So we right away began to develop interventions to make our treatment services more effective for that group. And I have to say that we had a lot of success at that time because we didn't really have a choice. We were left with a situation, either incarceration or come up with a treatment intervention that would be effective for that group. So that's kind of where HEAT came from. HEAT was developed by myself and Dr. Guy Wheeler from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we probably worked on this intervention for almost 10 years before we tested it. And we've had a lot of success with this model. So I'm here today to talk about what is HEAT, habilitation, empowerment, accountability therapy. HEAT is an intervention for 18 to 29-year-old black males or African American males. Now we chose the word black males because we wanted to make sure that the language would be inclusive. Some African American populations are more comfortable being called African American. Then there were some groups that really didn't identify with that title, particularly populations from the Caribbean or who were from the continent of Africa, didn't really identify with being labeled as African American. So we used the word black males in our curriculum to ensure that we included black populations. Substance use disorder and substance misuse, mild, moderate. HEAT is an intervention that, again, for populations that have a severe diagnosis as well as a substance misuse, mild or moderate diagnosis. The length of the program is 9 months, and participants can either have misdemeanors or they can have felonies. Both populations we have tested, and it works very well with both of those populations. The risk need responsivity, and as suggested by its name, it is based on the 3 principles. The risk principle asserts that criminal behavior can be reliably predicted and that treatment should focus on higher risk offenders. And HEAT does that. The need principle highlights the importance of criminogenic needs in the design and delivery of treatment. And then, of course, responsivity principle describes how the treatment should be provided. And HEAT you can use in that way to ensure that the level of care that is needed is provided through the intervention. Responsivity really emphasizes accountability, and that's the A in HEAT. We really want to focus on ensuring that this high criminogenic population will have accountability built in. So there are mechanisms within the curriculum to ensure that accountability is in place. HEAT is designed specifically for a population that is ambivalent. If a client is resistant, they don't want to be there, they have a bad attitude, they're not motivated. Even on the stages of change, we will say that this is probably a contemplation population. These are the clients that don't want to be there. They hate your guts, they're cussing, their posture, their whole attitude is, I don't want to be here. And HEAT is designed to work with that participant. It's a cognitive-based intervention, and so it's more intrinsic rather than extrinsic. If you're displaying behavior, we pay more attention to the thinking and to the decision-making and to the spirit of the individual. It's trauma-informed. We fully understand that probably trauma is the most important part of this curriculum. This is a highly trauma-impacted population. And the research supports that HEAT is a promising practice. We'll talk more later about that, but we're very happy that we've had a couple clinical trials already, and HEAT shows that it is a promising practice, and the research really supports that, and we're very proud of that. But we still have a lot of more work to do as we move more toward evidence-based. HEAT is currently all over the United States. In Colorado, we have programs in Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, Portland, Oregon, Texas, and the state of Washington. So HEAT is already across the United States. Now, we take more of a habilitative perspective than a rehabilitative perspective. This is for a population of clients that if you try to rehabilitate this population, you're still going to have basically the person that, even though they're not using drugs, they may still participate in criminogenic behavior. So we're assuming that this population in this population, we're building for the first time skills, day-to-day skills that they need in making decisions, how you make less impulsive choices. And many of these participants may even have a attention deficit, a hyperactive disorder, and they have impulse control issues. Some, again, lack the ability to sustain day-to-day relationships. So these kind of issues make treatment very difficult when you have these underlying issues. So we take a rehabilitative perspective off the table and address more from a habilitative perspective, which is the letter H in HEAT, which is habilitation. This participation we fully expect from some of the studies that were done with the Persistent Effective Treatment Survey. We know that the primary substance of choice for this population is going to be marijuana. We understand that if it wasn't for the criminal justice system, many of these participants wouldn't have a treatment as an option in the first place. So the referrals of this population we fully expect will come through the criminal justice system. And I'm sure it's no surprise that most of this population come from single parent homes. Now we really need to pay attention to the high rate of victimization. Then that should be a red flag for most of us. That signifies that this population is going to be impacted by trauma. If they have high rates of victimization, that means that trauma is going to be a day-to-day, and re-traumatization is going to be a day-to-day issue. High rates of sexual activity. HEAT actually addresses responsible sexual activity. We do that very intentional, very deliberately, because we have to not only be concerned about things like HIV, AIDS, other sexual transmitted diseases, but we also have to look at the fact that there are a lot of unwanted pregnancies. And, you know, many times that these young men are left with high child support payments and children all over the place, and really lack the ability to navigate systems in order to effectively be the father that they need to be. So we really focus a lot on reckless sexual behavior in this curriculum. And we also note that from the survey summary, we know that this population may have less severe substance use disorders or symptoms at the time of admission. So we know that even though substance abuse is an issue, but it may be less severe in many cases with this young African-American male, young black populations. Some of you all may be familiar with the work of Dr. Dwayne Williams, who's a psychologist, and he talked about black male identity issues. And In working with this population, we know that communalism, bonding, a preference for interdependence versus independence is important. Heat really tries to focus and capture the fact that you have these individuals in a group and we expect that they will bond, and we use that as a therapeutic means of engaging them in this curriculum. Movement we emphasize expression, and you have to understand that this population is going to be expressive, and maybe even some people will say aggressive, but I just say expressive because sometimes movement and the volume of the conversation may increase, and that's important in communicating with this population, and heat allows that type of interaction. We believe that mundane activities will lose this population, so you have to stimulate with the content of the information to ensure that they're engaged. And a lot of research has supported this, that content and the process of instruction are issues that are important to make sure that this information is not only relevant, but engaging. Cultural relevancy is important. It's actually, cultural relevancy was a label that was coined by Professor Gloria Ladson Billings. Culturally relevant teaching is important to talking to specific populations about their history, about their culture, about their experiences, about their values, and to not discuss these things is actually disengaging them. But when you talk about the importance and the legacy that these individuals have, young African American males have an amazing legacy, an amazing culture and history, and using that as a way to engage, and not only to engage, but we want to use it to heal and use the strengths of the culture and these experiences to heal them as individuals. So he takes a perspective that the lifestyle that many of these young men live is probably even more dangerous than the drugs they use. Lifestyle can be very dangerous for many of these individuals. So we address not only the substance use disorder, but understanding that the lifestyle and the choices and the criminogenic aspect of their living could be probably as hazardous and even more hazardous than the drugs that they use. Again, trauma, I can't explain enough how important trauma with this problem. This is a highly impacted trauma population. You know, and our approach in this is understanding we need to stop asking what's wrong with this population. Why are they so difficult to engage? Why are they not participating and not verbal and have a bad attitude? And what's up? We need to stop asking those questions and ask more what happened. Instead of asking what's wrong, what happened? What are the experiences that causes an individual to, and in trauma, we look more at the experiences and the emotional, painful, distressing experiences that an individual has and overwhelms their ability to cope. However, we think that many of the issues with this population is chronic adversity. Things like discrimination, racism, oppression, and poverty. And when you have these issues that are ongoing, it's like reoccurring, relentless, pervasive trauma that's never ending for this population. And we know from the ACE studies, many of you all may be familiar with the ACE studies that happened back in 2009. We know trauma is cumulative. And we know that it affects the brain, meaning it wires the way an individual thinks. And we know that the brain, even highly impacted brain from trauma, is basically wired to do one thing, and that is survival. And as a result, we see highly risky behaviors such as smoking, drinking, overeating as a means of coping. Trauma we know that it is directly related to mental health symptoms, substance misuse, chronic physical illness, and even early mortality. I believe with this population, violence and trauma is the core of everything that we see. All the symptoms that we see going on with this population, trauma is at the core. Whether it's issues with substance use, whether it's criminogenic behavior, whether it's problems with employment, PTSD, all these things at the core of it, I believe violence and trauma is the issue. And we have to understand, if we're going to look at trauma specifically, how it plays out in a very racialized fashion, we have to understand the history and the level of violence towards black people, black men in America. It is shocking. And we have to understand that. And those issues it's very impactful with and has clinical implications. The earlier and more deliberate the violence, the more devastating the impact. And it's not just a singular occurrence. It's not an adverse childhood experience. It is ongoing, as I said. It is relentless. It is pervasive. And it's not just from childhood. It is day to day dealing with life circumstances. And it is, as I said earlier, it is ongoing. We have to understand that black people are resilient, and that is a strength. And we tap into that strength of resiliency with this curriculum. And you have to also understand with this population that trauma, even though we can see the trauma, we know the trauma is there, but many may even deny or they're unaware of the challenges related to trauma. And we know that trauma is often rooted in childhood experiences, again, through the family and experiences, and it sometimes gives an alternate coping skills in moving on with their lives. But in trauma, as we know, some of the symptoms that you see with this population, ask them about nightmares and flashbacks and issues with nausea and headaches and hypersensitivity, difficult sleeping, emotional unpredictability. You're going to see that with this population. Again, they may not be aware of why it's happening, but if you ask them very specifically, you will begin to see a lot of these symptoms that has gone on for years and virtually undiagnosed. Many poor black neighborhoods in our country are dealing with things like the war on drugs, issues with stop and frisk, driving while black. These are things that black men have to deal with that are re-traumatizing. These events, a black man being pulled over by the police in these times could be re-traumatizing and could really trigger a PTSD response in dealing with these situations. And trauma is also exacerbated when combined with poor education, as I talked about, poverty, and it makes their worldview limited. So the remedy for many of these populations, many of these individuals, is self-medicating with substances or even negative behaviors like criminal involvement as a result of dealing with this trauma. Folk, mass incarceration probably has been one of the most devastating things that has occurred in black populations. We know the statistics of the impact. We know that 70% chance that black men who hasn't had a high school diploma or GED will end up in jail before he reaches his mid-30s. That is devastating. A black child under age 14 has a 50% chance of having a father to go to prison compared to 10% for a white child. Folks, this has been devastating to the black community, and we have to understand that these issues have clinical implications when we're working with these populations. Racism, this may be surprising to some of you all, but racism is hazardous to your health. And when we have the research and we have the information to support that, not whether it's the negative or rejecting or demeaning societal messages, or it could be just the internalized racism that a person feels, and as a result of these negative messages, how they internalize these messages and have low self-esteem. We know that stress related to racism is now medically connected to things like hypertension. You know, black men in America have the highest rates of hypertension in the world. And we now know that racism plays a major part in why black men have such high rates of hypertension. Cardiovascular disease, which is an issue that many black men are faced with, diabetes, and we even now see that infant mortality is connected to racism. There's a book written by Dr. Joy DeGruy. It's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. I suggest that all of you all read this book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And some very interesting things that Dr. DeGruy highlighted about vacant esteem. And this is the insufficient development, along with feelings of hopelessness and depression and general self-destructive outlook. And we see these things with many of the young black men when they come into treatment, or they come in for services, or come into our drug courts. They have a marked propensity for anger and violence, extreme feelings of suspicion, not trusting, and these are based on perceived negative motivations of others. And a lot of times the violence is against themselves or to their own community and to property and to others. And these are very important issues to look at. And Dr. Joy DeGruy connected many of these issues to the impact of the 400 years that African Americans have been in this country. She also talks about a racist socialization, which is more of that internalized oppression, and things like learned helplessness and literacy deprivation and distorted self-concept and an antipathy and aversion from the following. Things like members of one's own identified and cultural ethnic group, the mores and the customs associated with one's own identified and cultural ethnic heritage. The physical characteristics, even things like nose, lips, physical features of being black are that this population has an aversion and an antipathy for. And this is as a result of more of this internalized racism issue. And folks, these have clinical ramifications, and we need to understand that when these young black men are in our groups or come to our drug courts, these are issues that they're dealing with and that we have to face and learn how to handle. And which really we have to understand that PTSD, how are our young black men dealing with that? And we know from the research that when an individual, for example, smokes marijuana, that the brain develops what is called CB1s, and they're activated when an individual smokes marijuana, hence which supports the study from the persistent effective treatment surveys, why this population uses so much marijuana. So in an attempt to relieve the symptoms, we have found in some research that marijuana works to relieve these symptoms better than legal medications. And I know that there may be other research that doesn't support that, but we've also seen research that does support that marijuana relieves these symptoms. And we wonder why we can't get this population to stop smoking marijuana. Well, it's understandable when dealing with some of the realities and the reoccurring issues with trauma, that many times marijuana may be a way of surviving, a way of dealing with life's circumstances. So these have implications that we need to consider. So HEAT is a trauma-informed approach. We talk about safety is probably the most important aspect. And that's why the group and the communal bonding that is supported through this curriculum is so important. The clients have to feel, the participants in HEAT have to feel, number one, safe. There has to be a sense of trustworthiness and transparency. And even though I'm your therapist and I work with drug court and I work with the drug court team, but I have to be transparent and show the participant that what I say is what I mean, and there's no hidden agenda. You have to include collaboration and some type of mutuality amongst the group. Building group cohesion is very important. The E in HEAT is empowerment. Folk, I can't begin to, I can't express to you enough how important empowerment in this curriculum is. Empowerment not only to a reawakening and an acceptance of my culture and my heritage, but also empowerment as a way of a collective efficacy, if you will, addressing issues and socioeconomic issues in my community, looking at social determinants and learning how to become an advocate to change my community. This is very empowering with this conversation, and it's also a trauma-informed approach. Peer support and mutual self-help, resiliency. It's a strength-based intervention. Again, inclusiveness, of course, the cultural and historical. It's a gender-specific focus. And of course, we understand the change process, moving the participant from a pre-contemplative state all the way through to understanding that they're taking action and being empowered to actually do something about the issues, not only themselves, but also address the issues in their community. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of HEAT. Let's look at actually what this curriculum really is. HEAT, it's time for a change, and these are some of the key elements. It's strength-based. We have to understand that we have to tap into what are the strengths, even though we understand that there is an antipathy and an aversion of self because of the negative self-images, but there are a lot of strengths like resiliency, a lot of other strengths in our culture, in the Black culture that we tap into. So we use culture as a way, again, not only to engage the participant, but using as a way of healing. I talked about how important empowerment is. And again, probably the E in HEAT is truly the important moderators of what makes this curriculum really effective. We teach about knowledge of self. In Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, she talks about knowledge of self is the most important factor in working with Black population, teaching them about heritage, their culture, and the strengths of the culture. She has even talked about how that this can be a way of showing that a participant will less likely to use drugs, they're less likely to commit violent offenses, they're less likely to do many other self-destructive behaviors as a result of knowledge of self. Family is a critical element to this. A community, we emphasize collective responsibility. You know, there's an African principle that says it takes a village to raise a child. And collective responsibility really is a part of that. That not only do I have an obligation to make better choices, to improve myself, but I also have an obligation. If I was to tell you, for example, why I am what has been the successes in my life, I could tell you that, yeah, I went to college, or yeah, I made some good choices along the way, but probably I would not finish that conversation unless I told you collectively of how my ancestors and how my parents and how some others who came before me made opportunities available for me. And this is part of that collective responsibility that I am here today, not only because of what I've done as an individual, but because of the collective of my ancestors that made a way for me. And I have a responsibility to do that for others coming behind me. That's an example of how collective responsibility works. Spirituality, folk, is an important part. It's probably the foundation of what HEAT is. We teach it by principles to live by. It's not religiosity. It's not dogma. It is more principles to build character in an individual. Once we hopefully through a cognitive intervention, show better how an individual can make better choices and educating them to make decisions and errors in their thinking. But then we replace that with principles to live by in order to build that character. And that's probably why HEAT is the center, at the center of this intervention is spirituality. And it's woven into all the other aspects. Folks, we believe that pre-treatment is important. And before an individual can walk into a HEAT session, we suggest strongly that they have pre-treatment. We actually call it orientation. And orientation is where you build rapport, you address ambivalence, resistance. Those things are met head on to ensure that that person is going to be engaged once they actually start. Now, if you notice, HEAT is actually circular. And that's an Afrocentric principle that we believe that this model is more effective in engaging Black populations because it's not linear and it's circular, meaning that it's never ending, meaning that all the parts are interconnected. And that's really important and many times it's hard to measure through European standards of how effective it is because it's circular and most of our research methodology is based on a more linear fashion. But HEAT is circular and we deal with things like self. And we spend a lot of time talking about self. We talk about family, and community is not ancillary with this model. It is actually an integral part of this individual. So we try to be holistic with HEAT. HEAT is a holistic dealing not only with self, with family and community, but having spirituality as the core. And we believe that this model addresses the individual more holistically. Again, orientation is important. And it really is not only a way to establish a rapport, but to build that relationship. The therapeutic relationship is probably the most important tool that a therapist has, no matter what tool you're using. Building a relationship is important, and we do that in orientation. But it's not only just doing that that's important, but we also want to educate. What is it that you're about to embark upon? What is this curriculum? What are the expectations? What am I going to learn? And I think it's only fair that orientation, we allow the participant to know fully of what they're prepared to enter into. So orientation is important. We talk about self. Folk, you can look at these, and as I mentioned earlier, that content is important. And I think that is why we have seen from many of our research of why HEAT is engaging. It's because it has a lot to do with the content. Stay out of the heat. Notice the titles here, Black Manhood. I had someone to ask me, what's the difference between Black manhood and white manhood or any other ethnic group manhood? And again, the focus on Black manhood is strictly just the fact of understanding Afrocentric principles and understanding that there are nuances associated with Black manhood that may be different from other ethnic groups. Principles are universally applicable, but still the emphasis on the importance of culture and heritage as a way of emphasizing the strengths of the intervention. Decisions, high cost of low living, messed up thinking, effort. Now, some people ask us, what does effort mean? I'll just say it means forget it. That's just one way of saying it. The last ports, where we look at hip hop and the influence of hip hop culture on this particular population. Blame, survival. Survival is a piece that we talk about PTSD and the issues with trauma very directly, where we look and educate the participant on some of the symptoms that they may have and looking at some of these symptoms of how they impact their lives. Disrespect and hustling and the ideal self. And these are the topics that are in the self. Again, these are 12 sessions. Again, the entire intervention lasts 36 weeks, but these are 12 interventions that are in self. The family section, we feel that the black family, the role of the black family is a very important part of the individual participant. And so we talk about how their drug using or their criminal activity impacts the black family and how they play a part in maybe bringing dysfunction to the family. So we look at that as an issue and impact on the black family. We look at wounded, forgiveness, which is a very difficult piece to train or to actually facilitate. Enabling and entitlement. Many of these young men have a sense of entitlement, so we address that. Absent father, surviving the absent father. Again, single parent homes is an issue that we see, and many of these young men have issues as it relates to the father not being there, or if they were there, they were not actively involved in their lives, and that's a huge issue. Breaking the change, how we see generational issues associated with not only substance use disorders, but we also see generational incarceration. So we address that as part of the curriculum. Love or lust. Listen, folks, if you're looking at a population that has high sexual behavior and you're not looking at the recklessness of irresponsible sexual behavior, we're missing the mark. And we believe HEAT does that very intentionally in order to address many of these issues that come with this type of behavior. Intimate partner violence, a very important issue. Baby mama drama. Man, I know that that's a very hot button topic, but it simply means co-parenting and the importance of co-parenting and why it's so important that these young men, if they have children, that they be in the lives of their children and figuring ways, strategic ways, and we give them tools of how they can more effectively co-parent with their child's mother. Being an involved father, strengths of the black family, again, looking at the heritage, looking at the culture, looking at the legacy of family and how important that's been in the black community. We also look at community. Now, community, again, we look at not only why and how their community may appear unhealthy and unsafe, but we look at root causes. We look at social determinants. We look at what are the issues that make communities unhealthy and unsafe. Now, throughout the entire curriculum, we have focused on individualism, individual choices, and the individual needs to work on themselves and their family. But we shift gears in the community piece, and we also put the responsibility on them that they have an obligation to look at their communities, and if there are issues with health and safety in their community, that they have a responsibility to change it. So we look at what these social determinants are, what are the institutional barriers to equity. We teach them advocacy, policy, social justice, teach them leadership, teach them to not only to look at the root causes of these issues, but to look at how they can heal. We use a tool in this curriculum called Photo Voice, and we use Photo Voice as a mechanism of giving them a voice to talk about what are the issues. And we invite community leaders and policymakers where these men can exhibit their Photo Voice project as a way of speaking truth to power. Very empowering piece, and it's all part of this curriculum. And it's a piece that we feel like now that we have an individual that has addressed their issues, but now they also are leaders in their community, and we feel like that is very empowering. The spirituality components, again, are mostly just to focus on character building. You know, if we look at changing the individual's thinking and cognitively, intrinsically address their abilities to make better choices, then we have to replace that with something, with things like character. So we look at these spiritual principles like honesty, acceptance, perseverance, accountability, and many of these things like hope and faith that the Black ancestors had in order for them to survive trauma, and how our ancestors were able to overcome all the obstacles that they had to endure. They had to have things like hope and faith as a way of just getting through. You know, my grandmother used to say things like, trouble don't last always. And she believed in that no matter what things look like, that if you had hope and you had faith, you can persevere. So we teach those type of principles to this population, teaching them things like responsibility, forgiveness, teaching them to make a commitment not only to themselves, to their families, but to their community, and the strengths of the culture. And then we also talk about the importance of love. And these things are very much I think, probably the core of how HEAT operates. We have had 2 clinical trials, 2 studies that have been performed. The first one was done at a drug court in Lexington, Kentucky. And we were very fortunate to be able to go into this drug court and to use this intervention. And we saw things right away that really showed a much better outcomes with this population, things like housing stability, things like employment. Of course, we saw improvements in substance use, substance misuse, and mental health, increase in drug abstinence, which a lot of drug courts measure, a reduction in substance use. We saw that with this population. We also saw a reduction in depression and anxiety and violent behavior. We also saw an increase in attendance and pro-social activities, non-religious self-help groups, and recovery supports. We're very proud of that study, and we saw some very, very positive outcomes. Our second research project was done in Indianapolis, Indiana, Marion County Reentry Court, where there was a very high-risk, high-need population. This population, because they were re-entering the community, had many barriers facing meaningful employment, gaining meaningful employment, and safe, secure housing, and they were very resistant to the HEAT intervention. However, they did become much more receptive to the intervention later. We're very proud that 74% of the experimental group with this population was successful. So we know that this intervention from the research shows a lot of promise. We've got more work to do to show the effectiveness of it, but we know HEAT is a promising practice because of the studies that have been done. There are some clinical considerations that we did learn, lessons learned from these projects. Many of the issues associated with boundaries. We have to ensure that the therapist has boundaries when working with this population. We were surprised to see how responsive and how positively they responded to things like structure and rules and guidelines. With this population, we found that confronting issues and addressing and pointing the finger at a participant was not the way to engage this population. And you can put yourself in a very precarious situation when you do that. So we suggest that you do not confront in group issue. You have to be careful. And if you do confront, not to say that you can't confront, you have to be careful, but you can do it much more effectively if you have that very, very close therapeutic relationship. The risk need, we saw that we initially thought that this was going to be a population that was very high in the risk, on the risk scale, and the need as far as substance use disorder, they would be moderate or low, but we found that this intervention also worked as well with high need populations, populations that had high substance use disorders, and worked very effectively. One of the issues, because of historical trauma and because of absent father issues, this population had issues with black male authority, and we had to navigate that very carefully. You have to understand that this is a very gender-specific curriculum. So when you have populations trying to facilitate this agenda this curriculum, we have found that African American males may do a better job at providing this intervention to this group, and also addressing the cultural specificity as well. And I encourage you in working with this population that you do a lot of praying, as you're going to need it because it's a very challenging group. Some of the operational considerations that you need to look at: case management. Heat does not work well in just a vacuum. You've got to have strong case management. This population has a multiplicity of needs and issues, so ensuring that all their needs are being addressed, case management is important. Mentoring. If you get nothing else out of this, understand that with this population, mentoring is a key component. Of course, jobs, we know that a meaningful job reduces recidivism, so having meaningful employment is a key element. Housing. Also understand that not only education from the standpoint of them getting their high school diploma, GED, some of these guys may even be interested in going to college, but literacy could be an issue. So make sure you pay attention to the literacy levels of this population. Accountability, again, that's the A in HEAT. Accountability is important. Doing what you say that you're going to do, not just making idle threats, but not only just making threats, but holding the participant accountable. Having the group, because of the interconnectedness that they have and the bonding that they've made, having the group members to hold each other accountable. We also have seen where we use ecumenical groups, not only just one specific religious group, but in the communities that you operate, figuring out how to involve the ecumenical community in these sessions. The participants may find that going to these groups, these pro-social sessions with ecumenical groups, more inviting or more engaging, are more attractive than going to AA or NA meetings. In most of our studies, in most of the groups that we've seen across the country, having a recovery coach, or in some cases, recovery specialist, having this person help co-facilitate or just being a part of that group can be very, very helpful. Thank you all for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, give us a call. If you're interested in implementing, we have trainings available for facilitators that are interested in using this intervention. Please call us or just call us to make comments. We appreciate your time. Thank you.